We have a bumper edition of Lefties Losing It, including this Sydney dude who lost it when he saw posters of kidnapped Israelis being put up.
That's enough, Bondi. I'm going to out a new town.
Say it again. Huh?
Henry, my ass. Off you go, love. You're whiter than the English that gave you the land, you animals.
What's your name? Say your name.
What's my name?
What's your name?
What's my name?
You want to be proud of yourself?
Oh, charming. You may have heard him say there, pay off back to North Bondi and get the F out of Newtown. And you're whiter than the English, they gave you the land, you effing animals. Dude with a thick English accent telling Sydney-siders to get the F out of his suburb. That may be what our Jewish friends call a bad case of chutzpah. The Daily Telegraph reports that man is a leading wine expert, Harry Hunter, who denied pulling down any posters of kidnapped victims, but he did admit to pulling down a Free Palestine from Hamas poster. Why in God's name would somebody do that? Does he hate Palestinians? Does he not want them to be free from the tyrannical rule of Hamas terrorists? This wine expert, Harry Hunter, says he is a staunch anti-colonialist, that's hard to say. I mean, what are you doing in Australia then, mate? That would be my first question to him. But this sort of feral behaviour on Australian streets from anti-Western civilisation miscreants should not be surprising to any of us when we see this sort of feral behaviour in the Australian Parliament from anti-Western civilisation miscreants. I speak, of course, of the Greens and most of the Teals too. This week we saw an unedifying spectacle in the upper house. The pathetic, petulant display from the Greens was a source of embarrassment for the country, the Greens parliamentary party and their constituents. If you support that type of infantile, irrational, anti-Australian behaviour, then you've been failed by the education system, the culture, your parents, or perhaps all of the above. Earlier this week, Greens Deputy Leader Mehreen Faruqi, draped in a black and white keffiyeh, a symbol that is synonymous with Palestinian nationalism, well, she stood in the upper house and accused our ally Israel of war crimes before raising her fist and shrieking, "Free, free Palestine."
The coalition is morally bankrupt when it comes to Palestine, and Labour has shown itself to be heartless, gutless cowards. You are watching the massacre of thousands of Palestinians by Israel, and you are not condemning Israel. You refuse to call for an immediate ceasefire. Well, we are not going to sit here and watch you pat yourselves on the back for doing nothing. Weasel words are not going to stop war crimes. Today, we bring the people's protest into Parliament. Free, free Palestine.
Thank you.
Immediately following this outburst, all the Greens senators stood up and walked out of the chamber in unison, if only they stayed out. And you can see there Victorian MP Janet Rice lifting a printed Palestinian flag above her head. We'll see that in a sec. The whole thing was an attention-seeking stunt that deserves to be mocked. Whether it's at federal level, state or local government level, the Greens can be relied upon to push dumb, destructive policies. We may laugh when the Greens-dominated Yarra Council flies the asexual, the aromantic flag at council buildings, but really there's nothing funny about the damage this extreme left ideology is inflicting on this country. And for too long, this malignant force in Australian politics has been treated with kid gloves. Perhaps because they have zero chance of governing in their own right, the Greens are held to a much lower standard than Labor and the Coalition. Or more likely, the lack of censure has more to do with the fact that the Greens' worldview is shared with many in the mainstream media. After all, One Nation has little hope of forming government, but it's subjected to a far heavier scrutiny and criticism than the Greens, who have succeeded in pulling both Labor and the Coalition to the left. And that was again evident today when Prime Minister Anthony Albanese signed a bilateral treaty at the Pacific Islands Forum with the Tuvalu Prime Minister.
Australia will support Tuvalu's climate adaptation interests.
including an additional $16.9 million for the Tuvalu Coastal Adaptation Project to expand the main island's Funafuti's land by around 6%. Australia will contribute to the new Pacific Resilience Facility, a Pacific-built trust fund that will be established to invest in small-scale climate and disaster-resilient projects just for the Pacific, as well as make a contribution to the Green Climate Fund.
So the PM has opened the chequebook, and this treaty will also see the Australian government offer refuge to Tuvalu residents because Airbus Albo believes climate change is threatening to wipe out their island home.
Tuvalu is extremely vulnerable to the impact of climate change, especially rising sea levels, and is trying to preserve its culture, traditions and land. I believe that developed nations have a responsibility to provide assistance, and that is precisely what we are doing.
So we are told Tuvalu, or Tuvalu as the Prime Minister calls it, is extremely vulnerable to the impact of climate change, particularly rising sea levels. Really? Even the climate catastrophists of the ABC say Tuvalu is growing. In 2018, they fact-checked a claim by Craig Kelly that the science tells us that Tuvalu, which I often hear about, is actually growing, not sinking. Well, what did the global warming crusaders at the ABC find? Their verdict was, Mr. Kelly's claims, check out. In the 4 decades to 2014, Tuvalu's total land area grew by 73 hectares, or 2.9%. The expert behind this research told FactCheck the nation's islands were continually adjusting and that the new land was habitable. But that's not to say Pacific nations are not at risk from rising seas. Well, of course, there has to be a disclaimer of sorts to lessen the blow. But there you go, Tuvalu, between 1971 and 2014, grew by 2.9%. That's habitable land. And we have the PM over there signing checks and treaties and acting like the whole joint is sinking into the ocean. And finally, on the PM, his antics in the Pacific have been labelled Shakira diplomacy, thanks to this performance. But just a word of advice for the young reporter who coined that term. This is Shakira. That's Shakira. This is Albo. And just watch him work there, that ain't Shakira. And unless you want to start a war with Latin America and most of the Middle East, I'd stop using that phrase immediately.